This event is sponsored by the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, NAZCCA, and by the City of Flagstaff, who has provided this wonderful, this fine space for us. NAZCCA is a volunteer citizens organization, grassroots, all volunteers. So that's why we're hoping that by coming here, you will also want to get involved. We are dedicated to helping people understand about climate change. And we do this all voluntarily, so if you can make a donation to help us with the various costs that come from putting these kinds of events together, every donation is much appreciated. And the donation boxes up at this table. I was about to say both, but I guess here. And if you want, for tax purposes, we do have a form that you can use to record your donation. Okay. Well, all that said, welcome everybody. My name is Stefan Sommer. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Biological Sciences at NAU and also the Director of Education for the Mariam Powell Center for Environmental Research, also at NAU. So I'm doing this with NAZCCA, but it's certainly within my mission in my employment as well. I usually make presentations for NAZCCA and in other contexts about climate change that are very data-driven. Being of a scientific background, our culture is about data and evidence and critical thinking in the context of looking at evidence. But data charts and graphs and figures don't necessarily reach everybody, and so we wanted to do something different this time. What we wanted to do was invite a number of elders to come in and tell stories of the changes they have seen across their lifetimes here in Flagstaff and in northern Arizona. And so this is a very different approach. If y'all are looking for the data, it's not going to happen so much today, but you can welcome to come to one of my other presentations and I'll fill you full of it. So, and as far as I know, this is the first time that this kind of event has ever been organized, has taken place. Generally speaking, our society does not value elders nearly as much as we should. Elders bring a deep and long perspective on things, and with the changes that are taking place with climate change, I think that can be a really important perspective for us. Now that climate change is happening ever more quickly, we can start to see some of the changes. So over the last 50 years, certainly, we can see the changes. Over the last 30 years, even. But if you've just moved to Flagstaff recently, only been here for 10 years, you probably won't realize that things haven't always been the way you see them right now. If you're less than 30 years old, it might also be hard to have seen those changes. And so that's where the value of elders can really come in, folks who've had that long and deep perspective. So I want to thank our various elders for coming in. Come on up, everybody. We have Dineh artist Shonto Begay, river runner Donnie Dove, third generation ranching family member Jim Babbitt, and third generation Flagstaffian Coral Evans. And I'll give them more thorough introductions when we get to that. But I want to thank them very much for coming in and being willing to share their stories. I think this will be a very rich storytelling event. Before we get into that, I want to tell a brief science story. I just can't help myself, sorry. So, in the science story, and I'm sure you've heard many of these things already, it begins with the greenhouse effect, right? And we've known about the greenhouse effect since the early 1800s. It's not a mystery. We're very thankful for the greenhouse effect because it keeps our Earth within the temperature range that we've evolved in. without the greenhouse effect, liquid water would be very rare on our planet because it would be so cold. So the greenhouse effect is a good thing. And the way the greenhouse effect works is sunlight comes into our Earth, it heats up things on the surface, and then the greenhouse gases act as a blanket to keep that heat in, just like your blanket keeps your heat in at night. The issue with the greenhouse effect is that we're now thickening that blanket by adding much higher concentrations of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, but also nitrous oxide and methane and some of the others. So that means that we're trapping in more heat. And as we've been able to see, yes, the Earth's average temperature has been increasing. We've reached just over 1 degree centigrade warming. And so 1 degree centigrade might not sound like a whole lot. But think that's a lot of thermal energy. If you're taking the entire atmosphere of the Earth and the surface of the Earth and heating it up by 1 degree centigrade, how much heat energy is that? It's huge, right? It's a lot. And the same thing has been going on here in Flagstaff. So if you look at the temperature records for Flagstaff, we've seen the same kinds of increases. Most of the increase in our case has come from a raising of the minimum temperatures, and that's what's elevated our average here. We've had some higher numbers of hot days as well, but a lot of our change has been about removing those low temperatures. So we've added all this heat energy to the Earth. What does that do? Well, more heat in the atmosphere, that creates wind. It creates storms. It evaporates more water. Hot air has more water holding capacity than cold air. So it changes a lot of things, not just the temperature. Sometimes it's harder to predict in these global models just how temperature change is going to affect precipitation. But with more energy in the atmosphere, the one thing we are absolutely certain about is that we can expect more extremes. We're giving old man wind in the atmosphere that much more power to blow things around. And we can expect higher frequencies and strengths of storms, of droughts, of floods, of wildfires, and more loss of crop productivity. These are big things for us and for the world. In 2017, just to give you one piece of data. Sorry. These kinds of weather extremes in the form of hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and so forth, cost the United States over $308 billion. The report that just came out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is suggesting that if we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, those costs could go to over 50 trillion. So we need to do something, and according to the report, we need to do something right now and quickly. In November, an article was in the Wall Street Journal about corn productivity. And what it showed was that farmers in northern Alberta, in this little community of La Crete, they had already seen about a 3 degree centigrade rise. And there's a number of reasons behind why we get this, what's called polar amplification, higher rates of temperature rise in some of the higher latitudes. And they're shifting from traditional crops like winter wheat to corn because their growing season has gotten longer. The value of their agricultural land has increased every year for many years because of this. Whereas in Iowa, some years the value of corn growing land declines, other years up. So it's kind of bouncing up and down. And that's what we expect. We're already seeing the evidence of what all the models are telling us. that agricultural productivity will shift to the north. Of course, it's not just agricultural productivity. All the species that we're looking at. The Audubon Society has large data sets on birds, and every species that they've looked at is shifting north. So we're changing ecosystems. We're reshuffling ecological communities, and we don't always know what the outcome of that might be. One of the predictions for us here is that sometime during the 2020s, the 20s, we will be outside of the ideal range of growing conditions for ponderosa pine. And that's kind of scary for our region. But the point is not to scare y'all. The point is to motivate y'all to do things to reduce your carbon footprint. But with that, I want to hand this over to our storytellers. I hope that scientific story wasn't too much. And we're going to do this as if we're sitting around a campfire, because for time immemorial, our species has been telling each other stories around a campfire. So this table here is our campfire. Sorry, we don't have a real one. And we're going to tell these stories around the campfire. Out of respect for the speakers, I would ask that you hold your questions while they're telling their stories. But at the end, we should have, if everything goes as planned, we should have about a half an hour for y'all to ask questions, bring in your own stories or whatever. We can turn it into as much of a discussion as possible. Our first climate elder today is Shonto Begay. Shonto is a Dineh artist, born and raised in Shonto, Arizona. Of course, Shonto's people and traditions go back over 600 years in this region. So he has a rich tradition to draw from. Shonto tells me that he was a shepherd first and always. He was the youngest boy, and so he always got to watch the sheep. And sitting out watching the sheep, he learned to carefully observe not just the sheep, but the landscape. And then later, through sand painting, he learned how to express himself with careful lines and colors. And I think you can see how his talents have developed from those things. Careful observation of the landscape, culture, the human condition, and his talents of capturing that in color in his warm and beautiful paintings. Shonto has lived in Flagstaff for over 20 years, and he still makes a point of visiting his birthplace every week. Shonto is a member of the Bitterwater clan, born for the Salt clan, and he sees the world in both languages. Shonto.
All right. Yat-eh. Yat-eh, of course, is a word which just means beautiful, collectively, harmonious, and everything good. Yat-eh. I'm Shonto. I am from the Navajo Nation, and I was born and raised in Shonto, the community of Shonto area. And that's where my umbilical cord is still buried today. So I visit it every day, every week. And as such, trading space between the sacred mountain, the foot of the sacred mountain, and the resting place of my umbilical cord has been a ritual, and it allows me to go through the, time and space, crossing the Little Colorado Depression from here, back up to the Shonto Plateau, seeing all the various landscapes and the various landscape and the changes that's come through it. I was born into a very traditional Navajo family. My father was a medicine man, and my mother, of course, is a weaver. So between the chantings and the thump, thump, thump of the weaving tools, that was pretty much the soundtrack of my growing up. And of course, herding sheep out there, sitting under the tree somewhere, watching my flock down the valley, back and forth all day long. That's how I grew up. That's how I meditated. It was a meditation that I grew up in, a state of meditation, I should say. So this is a time that I was very much involved in, knowing the language of the landscape and then smelling rain days away, and seeing the curtain of what will become a dust storm later on, far to the south. So little observations like that through the shepherd's eye, and they've forged my vision. To this day, the paintings I do are still, derived from that. But the change that I've seen over all the time is, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very extreme. My birthplace is a community of Shonto. Shonto means a place there's a spring with the sunlight always on it. And the sunlight, the little light that plays on the surface of the water playing back onto the wall. That's pretty much where the name comes from. And Begay, of course, is a very common name. You hear Begay, the son of. So my name would literally translate the son of that phenomenon. So that's pretty much what I am. I'm a member of the Bitterwater clan, Twitch-Eatley, born for the Salt clan, a she. My maternal grandfather is a son of many goats. And my paternal grandfather is Dineh. We greet our people this way. Wherever we meet, we greet each other. That it establishes an immediate kinship, immediate network among people who are meeting. It also tells you how the clan system. It also tells, of course, who you can and can't marry. So it is a way of connecting with each other socially, and also an extension to the land, to the life, to the stories. So that what I've observed in various climate changes, I guess subtle changes, it's just that, springs are no longer where they used to be. The place I was born and raised, Shonto, there was a beautiful spring at the foot of the canyon wall. At the foot of the canyon wall, there's a dark, beautiful, cool pool, always dark with algae. And all around was berries, various plants that was beautiful. It's like almost like a tropic, underneath the weeping willows. That is no longer there. Where it once was is now a sand dune. For a long time, I wondered what happened to where did the water go? But no more. When my grandmother died, my older uncles had kind of a feud over who's going to inherit that portion of the land. So as such, nastiness has been exchanged. And my mother always said, that is the reason the land dried up. Bad words and bad action, bad thoughts and intentions are the one that also shrivels up our land, just as it shrivels us as humans and spirits. In the Navajo stories, we talk about, the various levels of creation, from the very bottom world, the first world, the creation story, the very first world, the dark world, the barren world, the cold world, where only insects and very tiny microbes and little worms and stuff like that existed. These were the inhabitants of that world. And through some desecration of sorts, through some action, they were forced to move out of there into the second world. The second world is a yellow world, and in that world, birds and small mammals like chipmunks and stuff like that, they were the one that was dominating. And again, through time, something happened. A lot of time related to the land itself and to the outer land, the inner land. Just desecrating it. They were forced to move out of that into the third world. In the third world, more mammal, deer, moose, buffaloes, bears, coyotes, this is where a lot of the bigger animals were formed. This is where the body of our stories, our creation story, our coyote story lies in the third world. So again, the third world was desecrated by the beings. This time, the desecration or insult to the water spirit, to the water being. So the beings were forced out of that into the fourth world here, which is where we're at now. We're forced out of each one of these worlds because of our own shortcomings and disrespect of the earth, the land, and ourselves. When we forget ceremonies, when we forget relationships, when we forget our connections as people to people, people to the land itself. So that's how the beings were forced into other worlds. There's no part of the story that says there is no fifth world. So it feels like we're maybe on the cusp of going to that, being forced into another world. So this is a story I thought I'd share with you for the from my perspective on the changes, the changing world, the changing levels of consciousness that the creation story brought about. So this is where it is now, and I'd like to read a little passage to you from one of my pieces I wrote years ago. Can you all hear me there?
Yes.
Okay, good.
The mic needs to
Pull it a little closer.
pull the mic a little closer.
Some years ago, I did a book,
Oh, yeah.
and you probably seen these. Some of these are very relevant because I work from that world. I work from that spirit. Like I was introduced. People ask me, how did you begin your art world? How did you begin your art journey? It was through the helping of the being drafted into the group of elders. When one of the elders that were expert in sand painting didn't show up one day, I was drafted. Somebody said, there's a kid who can draw this sheep camp. So I was drawn into it. So that's where I drew my very first line. But I had no creative liberty because it's an ancient template. We can't deviate from that. So that's the very first line I drew was for healing. For healing. And so that's, I try to keep my work there, the spirit of that there today, for healing. Into the new world. My grandfather's prayer is disturbed. In the morning, he walks slowly out the door, sadness upon his once strong face. With a slow gait, he walks towards the east. The blazing sun rises behind the coal mine upon the mesa. The air smells smoke and not from cook fire. The trampled ground littered with bottles and papers, souvenirs of ceremony 2 nights ago. My grandfather's prayer is disturbed. The wind that carries his pollen lightly hangs heavy. Trucks on the distant highway blare their impatience. Boughs of pinon and junipers are parched brown. The rain clouds have abandoned us this summer. The watering hole dried up. Upon a mesa, machines big as buildings, machines like I've never seen, like he's never seen, continue to rip into the earth. My grandfather's prayer is disturbed. The early sky is already slashed with jet streams, threads of white from which no water falls. Lightning flash of light from the jet far above mocks the thirsty earth. And the roar that follows, far behind, laws of nature disturbed and distorted. My grandfather's prayer is disturbed. The ground rumbles slightly as a coal train takes away another load. Explosives shakes the mesa as new veins are opened. The mesa will seem smaller this evening. My prayers are disturbed. Still we sprinkle pollen for another day. Still we have faith. Yeah. So it is through a lot of these stories that we view the earth and the consequences that follows if we disturb it in any form or desecrate it in any form. You know, so it is, it's just a two world that I live in. I spent my days here, 5 days a week here and 2 days out in Shonto, kind of dividing my time between the two. Because my mother still sits up there. My mother still sits on the mesa. She's 95 years old, and she still has a good amount to say. My sheep camp is still there. The goats are still there. The chickens are still there. The animals are still there. My umbilical cord is still buried there. So, you know, the thread that keeps me tied to the land is very strong still. And that's why I'm very grateful and very thankful for to be able to say that I go back to the land, where everything is very straight, organic, very it's not abstract like living in the city, away from the geometric form of lifestyle. But just to kind of end this little piece, some years ago, early one morning, I woke up in Shonto in my Hogan balcony up there. I woke up and rolled over, and the whole Black Mesa was kind of pink, kind of a pink tone. So I said, what the heck's going on? So as the day progressed, there was just a pink hue in the sky and all around. I welcome to the pink world. And as I was driving back home here later on, I heard on the radio it was from a great sandstorm in the Gobi Desert. It had risen to the atmosphere and dumped it here in the southwest, which turned the day pink that day. And the very same day, I ran into a swarm of migrating monarchs. So days like that, phenomenon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shonto, for sharing that rich story that brings in so much from so long in this region. Our next speaker today is Donnie Dove. Donnie is a river runner here from Flagstaff, Arizona. He started kayaking back in 1973 and has been on and around rivers now for 46 years. He and his wife Caroline have had their business Canyon River in Flagstaff for 29 years. So they know about the changes and how those changes affect business. Donnie knows boats and people, and he knows the rivers of northern Arizona. Today, Donnie will tell us about adventures on these rivers and the many changes that have taken place over the years. And it's not just the rivers. Even in Flagstaff, starting in 1990, he has seen many changes that have affected his business and his way of life. Thank you, Donnie.
Thank you, Stefan. All right, so I'm Donnie Dove, and my wife Caroline's right over there, and we've been in Flagstaff since 1990. She's embarrassed because she's going to have to leave to go meet a group coming off the river here in about 40 minutes, so she's going to sneak out on you, so I'm just going to go ahead and embarrass her right now. But anyway, what I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about is in 1990, you know, I've been coming to the Grand Canyon for quite a few years doing river trips, but we moved here to start a business. And we started Canyon River Equipment Outfitters here in Flagstaff. We've been here for 29 years, and we have loved every minute of it. Now, have we seen changes? You bet. We've seen a lot of changes. We moved into our house. It's been the only house we've been in since we've been here. We started renting, and we ended up buying it from the person we were renting from. And he kept telling me about this great house and how it was built by a guy named Bill King, who's supposed to be some super contractor, and that this was, you know, going to be the best house of all. And I said, sure, he wants to sell me the house. I'll just go ahead and buy it. And anyway, we bought the house, and guess what? It is a super house. It has been amazing. I have done very little. I have done almost nothing to be embarrassed about it. But a couple of coats of paint, a couple of roofs, And it's been 30 years that we've been there, and it has just been awesome. Now, having said that, you know, in those 30 years, has the weather stayed the same? No, it's changed a lot. And so when we first got here, you know, it was nice afternoons, evenings in the summertime. You'd had monsoon season. And I go, well, I guess it is kind of monsoon season. It'd be 3 o'clock and the rain would come for 45 minutes or an hour and then it'd go away. And it would be cooled down and the rest of the time would be there. Well, guess what? When Bill built our house, he didn't put any air conditioning in. And he didn't have to in the 70s when he built the house, because guess what? The climate was different. But by the time we got it in the 90s, the climate was already starting to change. The first few years, no big deal. It didn't get too hot. We'd sit there and could, you know, handle it. But by the 2000s, it was hot. And we could barely sleep upstairs sometimes. And it has gotten just worse since then. So just to give you a for instance, I'm pretty sure that a lot of other people probably know the same phenomenon if they've been here for very long. But for all the young people that haven't been around, that's what happens over a period of 30 years. Now, having said that, Stefan wanted me to tell you a little bit about the rivers and what's been changing about the rivers. We own 2 different companies. One company does commercial trips down on the Salt River, up on the San Juan River, and over in New Mexico on the Sommer River. Well, the Salt River, you know, is a free-flowing river. It has no dams, so you just have to sit there and take the water as it comes with the snow and what happens with the melt and stuff like that. And some years it melts fast, some years it melts slow. But it used to run about 3 out of every 5 years with a pretty good melt that we could sit there and count on. We could count on being able to go down there and have fun and show people the river and just, you know, show them what Arizona had to offer. But guess what? It don't do that no more. It comes about once every 5 years now. So that is a significant change, and that's transpired in the last 10 years, that this has really gotten down to this kind of a level here. Now, we do have a wonderful year right now with a lot of water, so this is the 1 year that we're just blessed with and that we're very appreciative of. So that was one of the major changes that we saw that had an impact on one of our businesses. You know, the other impact that we had is our Sommer River over in New Mexico. When we had all our droughts going on around there, guess what? Elephant Butte Reservoir down near Texas there was running out of water. So what do? They open up the reservoirs. And it was a federal mandate that when the big reservoir got so low that all the contributing reservoirs had to dump water. So they dumped all the water and ran it all the way down to Elephant Butte, reservoir, and we didn't have a river season. And that was kind of the demise of our Sommer River. After that, we could not count on it. Even though it is a federally mandated recreational river, that means it's supposed to run every weekend, starting in late June all the way through August. We could not count on it. So as a business model, it did not work anymore. And for people that are traveling from across the country and internationally to come and take part in a river adventure with their families, it just wasn't practical to be able to say, yeah, we can guarantee this. We could not. So that's one of the rivers there that we have. The Grand Canyon is another river that we outfit. When I say outfit, I mean we provide boats, transportation, food. We take people up to the river, we push them off, and we pick them up at the other end. So that's pretty much what outfitting is all about, and that's been a really joy for us. We've enjoyed all the people that we have met from all over the world, and we have brought 2 Flagstaff, and they have, we do 140,000 meals a year. So that is added to the economy of Flagstaff significantly. And so, that right there tells you what, the rivers have to offer. And just in case you guys want to go look up some data, I know Stefan's big on data. The Arizona Horizons, I don't know if anybody of you know that show, but it's a fun show. It's all about Arizona. The Audubon Society sit there and did a program, I think it was on April 9th. And there they sit there and said that the waterways and byways of Arizona are contributing $13.5 billion. That's everything from the fishing, the people buying the bait, the people going down rafting, motorboating, whatever you want to call it, but that's what has been there. it also adds about 114,000 jobs. So if we don't have the water, we don't have the waterways, guess what? That's all gone. So the economy suffers, jobs suffers, everybody suffers from that. But back to the Grand Canyon, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're having to endure now. We put people on, there's a nice paved road all the way up there, except when Cameron flash floods out. But for the most part, it's a straight shot to get to the river. At takeout, we have to go across the Wallapai Reservation. And the Wallapai Reservation have a road that goes down to the river, and it goes right through the middle of a creek bed. Well, this creek bed's fairly notorious. This is called Diamond Creek Road. And this creek bed has swallowed, trucks and vehicles and swept them out into the Colorado River. So that has happened when you have these torrential, monsoons. Well, back in the 90s, we used to sit there and could count on maybe one or two, flash floods a year, and that was it. You could, okay, that's just part of doing business. You just live with it. But now, in last year alone, there was like 13 days where there was flash floods. And so when it flash floods, and thank God that the Wallapai Indians are good about getting their graders and stuff out, but they have to start remanufacturing a whole new road. So that's kind of how, the river running business is. We've seen the changes in the fact it seems like that, as Stefan mentioned, that our climates are kind of moving north on us. So the temperature zones are moving north, and that's what we're feeling while we're out there on the river. I used to spend about 153 days a year on the water, and that meant I was outdoors and camping at night most of the time. And so I've seen a lot of change come from that. And when Mark contacted and asked me if I would come speak, I'm kind of like the John Doe of this elder council here. These are some very powerful, esteemed elders we have here, and I'm very privileged to be a part of this. But, I just going, wow, I need to say something. I need to tell people what's going on. And I need to sit there and make other people aware of what's going on, and that they need to say something. You guys need to sit there, and in this particular governmental situation we're in, we got to start talking. We got to start saying our piece, and we got to sit there and step up and be heard. And so that's what I got to say about it, and I'd like to sit there and thank you guys for letting me speak.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Donnie. Our next speaker today is Jim Babbitt. Jim is he's a third generation member of a pioneer family, well-known pioneer family that's been in the business of ranching and mercantile and a variety of things. And he's also a historian, so he has written books about the history of Flagstaff and a number of other things. Jim was born and raised in Flagstaff. His family have been ranchers and business owners here in Flagstaff for the last 130 years. He holds degrees from Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley, and has published many articles and books, primarily on local history. Jim is retired, but he still serves on the boards of the Grand Canyon Trust and the Wilderness Land Trust. And he's been very generous with his time to be able to come here and share some of these stories with y'all. So, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. Elder? Really? I've never been an elder for anything. And now it appears that I've achieved elderdom. So I'm going to have a hard time getting used to it, but as long as there's an extra discount at the movie theater, I can probably handle it. Just one little caveat about what I'm going to tell you. My little stories are anecdotal completely. They are not fact-based. They're not objective, and in many ways they're completely subjective. So kind of bear that in mind. In my growing up here in Flagstaff, everybody always talked about the weather. All the time it was the weather. And you've heard the old joke that if you don't like the weather right now, just wait for an hour and it'll change. And, you know, that addresses a real key difference in climate change versus weather change. And in my mind, weather is what's happening now and in the short term, and climate change addresses something in a much longer span of time. And I think that's important to keep that in that distinction in mind. So after Stefan had asked me to come and relate a few little anecdotes, I tried to think in my mind who really knows about the weather, a lot more than I do. Well, the first thing that came in my mind was Lee Bourne, the meteorologist. But no, I don't think so. So the next thing that came into my mind, as was alluded to before, with Shonto, were people who are out in the weather and on the land all the time. And in my case, that is the family's ranch and the cowboys, 15 or so couples who live year-round on about 700,000 acres of land. They're out there outdoors each and every day, 365 days a year. And like Shonto, they're pretty perceptive, and they're looking, you know, for subtle changes in the weather, because it really affects, like Donnie said, it affects their business. So I went to one of our longest term cowboys, and I said, have you noticed changes over your 35 years working as a cowboy on the ranch? And he said, oh boy, have I. And I said, well, if you had to point to one change that would really stand out in your mind, what would that be? And he didn't hesitate at all. He said, wind. And I said, really? Wind? That's about the last thing that I would have thought about. And I said, so what aspect of wind is so different now? And he said, well, we always had wind in the springtime. We all know that, March, April, May, wind. But he said, maybe 20 years ago, we started having windy falls. And they just really noticed that with each year going by, the falls become windier and windier. And why that's a big concern is that's the wrong time of the year for wind to be blowing on grasslands and drying them all out, and then hoping for a wet winter. So it really has negatively impacted the ranch and that way of life. And I just thought, I guess Stefan mentioned something about wind and all the extra energy added to the atmosphere that is causing some of these drastic changes in the climate cycle. So after that, I guess the second example that I would mention is Mormon Lake. Mormon Lake historically was the largest natural lake in the state of Arizona. Once reputed to be somewhere between 30 and 40 feet deep. My uncles and granduncles kept boats out at Mormon Lake, and for fishing and for duck hunting and so forth. I don't think they would get very far in their boats today. And I understand that there was probably some mechanical manipulation of the inflows, some of the drainages going into Mormon Lake. But nonetheless, you'd be hard pressed to see Mormon Lake as it once was. So then, the third thing is also a pretty personal story. I bet you didn't know I was a corn farmer. Well, I'm a proud corn farmer, backyard corn farmer, inheriting that talent from my grandfather and from my father, who were corn farmers. Well, all my growing up time, my dad would spend February and March going through the seed catalogs, looking for the shortest season corn possible. He would have got it down to 2 weeks if he could have. But he always said that you could only count on 3 months for corn, June, July, and August. certainly a freeze by early September, certainly. So guess what? My corn crop last year went in fairly early, second week in May, and I was still harvesting corn in early October. And I think that's, again, that's anecdotal. I'm not sure what it really means, but anyway, there you are. Maybe I should move to the Midwest where the prices are going up.
Alberta.
Or Alberta, yes, okay. I gotta watch my time here. The next kind of dramatic example also has to do with water and the Grand Canyon, Donnie. For a long time, I've been a backpacker primarily in the Grand Canyon on both trails and not so much trails, just wandering around. And I also became real interested long ago in history of the Grand Canyon and the early people who settled there. And one man I was always fascinated with was William Wallace Bass. And he had an early tourist camp, and he built a trail following a prehistoric route down to the river, and that's out to the west of the current day South Rim developed areas. He also had a stagecoach road, first from Ash Fork to his camp at the South Rim, and then later from Williams. So water has always been an issue at the Grand Canyon because there just isn't much. So he had to run the stagecoach line, provide for tourists at his encampment at the South Rim, and somehow get them to the river on mules and horses, and then get them back. So he developed a place that is known, and it was on topo maps. I don't think it is anymore, but it was called Mystic Spring. When I read that, I was just intrigued by that, Mystic Spring. How could that be? So I spent a long time looking around, hiking around, and following his writings. And there was a peculiar formation that overhung Mystic Spring. And I finally found it. And in the old books, Mystic Spring was under that formation, and it had a big cement and rock basin that he had constructed. And it was absolutely full of water. And that's what he used coming and going down to the river for his livestock and for his guests. Today, there is not a drop of water within miles of Mystic Spring. Okay, I won't take much more time here, but this one I kind of like a lot, and Coral, maybe you'll appreciate this. Back in the 1920s, the city fathers decided that it was time to build a dam. And the dam was going to go in Schweitzer Canyon. So they hired some engineers and developed, I've seen the plans, a very elaborate scheme to dam the mouth of Schweitzer Canyon to trap that huge flow of water that goes down there. Really? Not anymore. But they had something in mind, and they saw something, and they had a supply of water, and they thought that would be great. And I think they spent a good deal of money studying this, and then the Depression came along, and the dam never got built. But anyway, they had a big vision about that. So I have a couple more, but I think I am going to leave more time for the mayor.
Go ahead, Jim. Really, we've got lots of time.
Well, okay. You all know about the Francis Short Pond. In my youth known as City Pond. You know, what a descriptive name. Well, the City Pond was built to capture Antelope Springs, which is right in that part of the Rio de Flag drainage. and which was known to the first settlers to come through here as a big and reliable water source. Well, when the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad came through Flagstaff in 1882, they needed water badly. Those steam engines in those days, even though trains only came through town maybe twice a day instead of 100 times a day, those steam engines used a lot of water, 10,000 gallons per stop, per steam locomotive. Where's the water? Well, it's at City Pond. So they built a pipeline from City Pond down to the railroad and built a big storage tank and used that for years. And to do that, they had to put a dam across the Rio de Flag, just beyond, downstream from Antelope Spring. It's a very unusual dam. It's not a high dam, and there's a walkway across it, and there are big openings in the dam. So when it rose to a high enough level, it would spill through all those openings. Well, I have a very, very nice picture from about 1920 of Antelope Springs or City Pond pouring over not only the spillways, but over the top of the dam in a way that it's almost hard to imagine nowadays, even with big water years like 1993, I believe, when people were kayaking the Rio de Flag. So I love City Pond, and I'm glad we have the water and stuff, but I think it's a kind of a shadow of what used to be there. Okay, I'm going to retire and go to my elderdom.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Your stories remind me a little bit. I did some of my doctoral work at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and some of you might be familiar with Tucson. There's a dry riverbed that runs through it that once was the Santa Cruz River. Well, the stories back when I was a grad student down there were that they used to float barges in the Santa Cruz River, and there's not even a trickle anymore. Our next speaker, Coral Evans, has lived here in Flagstaff all her life, and she's our mayor. Some of you might know her. Coral's family has lived in Flagstaff for 3 generations, so she's got a rich history to draw from as well. She still lives in the family home that her grandfather built in 1942 in this very neighborhood, the South Side neighborhood. She's told me stories about when she was growing up and depending on a garden and a fruit tree and a variety of things, which I imagine she will be telling us about. In addition to being a local elected leader, Coral is also a community advocate, a student, a mother, and a crafter. So from all of these perspectives, Coral brings a rich tapestry of stories about the past and changes in Flagstaff. So welcome, Coral.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to just say how honored I am to be included as part of this panel of elders. You guys got that, right? Just want to make sure. But in all seriousness, to sit here and listen to the stories, I thought that Mr. Babbitt might talk about the beaver that used to be here. The stories are incredible. And I think that they show a depth, a level to Flagstaff perhaps that some of us may not have heard before because we are new. I also want to just take a moment to honor where we are today in the historic Murdoch, the Murdoch Center, which used to be the site of the Dunbar Elementary School, because I think it also shows where we were in Flagstaff and where we are now. And so I do want to start, and it's interesting to hear the different components of the stories that we heard. From what Shonto was saying, growing up with the sheep, there used to be sheep here in Flagstaff with the Bass sheep herders, to talking about the riverways. There used to be rivers here in Flagstaff. So just talking about the flooding and what Flagstaff is now. And I feel very privileged that I had the opportunity to grow up here in Flagstaff and experience what that was like. And that's really why I stayed here in Flagstaff. And I would say that definitely there's been some aspects that have gotten better, but there's also some aspects that I think have changed. And that makes me sad because my daughter, who is 4th generation, I kind of wonder what the 5th generation and the 6th generation is going to have to experience. Because I don't think that they will have the opportunity to experience the Flagstaff that I did. I want to start out by talking about my grandfather, because just listening to the stories, and I wrote all about him, because the stories really have to do with myself growing up. Sometimes I talk in plural because I have a twin brother who's 4 minutes older than me, and it was always the two of us together getting in trouble. So that's kind of how the stories go. But I wanted to start out in the backyard of the house that I live in now, because I spent the majority of the time there. My grandfather did what would now be considered urban farming. And I must have been about 11 or 12 before I realized that produce came from a store. Now I'm sure there were stores. On Larry Street store used to be Jalisco's, right down the street. It's the oldest continuously operated grocery store in Flagstaff, 5 houses down. So that was definitely there. But my grandfather, he grew everything from corn to squash to the green beans, the 3 sisters, I guess was what they're called, to beets. We had carrots, spinach, collard greens, lettuce, garlic, onions, and flowers. And he grew all that. And my grandfather passed away just before our 18th birthday. And my daughter and I were in the yard on Sunday. And I remember my grandpa was very clear, you should not plant anything before June 1st. And it needed to be ready to go because in September it was going to freeze. Because that's just the way it was in Flagstaff. And so this morning, in preparation of this, I went out into the yard. So my grandfather planted these, they're called Egyptian walking onions. And even though he passed away literally almost 30 years ago, the onions come back in the same spot every single year. And on Sunday when we were out in the yard preparing for this, this season, my daughter and I were like, hey look, the onions are ready to eat. That's ridiculous. And I'm here to tell you, it really, really is. We are in April, and I'm out here picking onions for our salad. So I went and picked some this morning. I have them in the bag. Feel free to, look and take them. But I picked this probably an hour before I came here today. But look at these. And we're in April, and they're already ready. And I don't want to say, I'm not a scientist. I don't even try to play one. I just think there's something wrong with the fact that the onions are already ready. I just think that's different. I wanted to talk about snow because I stayed here in Flagstaff definitely because it was a wonderful place to grow up. And I wanted my daughter to grow up here. But I also like 4 seasons. I grew up playing ice hockey. I love the snow. I love being out in the snow. And I think it was 2017. That was the first year that I remember there was no snow for Christmas. There was not even dirty snow on the ground. There was just no snow. And I remember thinking that definitely Christmas is the feeling and the family and the people that you're with. But I was sad. We were outside in the yard. I'm like, there's no snow. And then I started thinking, I remember growing up, Halloween. You never got the opportunity to see anyone's Halloween costume because it was too cold and it was snow on the ground. It would literally snow like the week before Halloween, and the snow would stay, and it would stay until well into March, and that was just the way it was. My grandfather had 2 little red shovels. They were literally this tall for myself and my twin brother to help with the snow. And I find that amazing. I think this year, I don't think there was any snow on the ground either. I know that we were out in December barbecuing in Flagstaff. And in one respect, you're like, hey, this is cool. In another respect, you're like, man, I remember when it snowed. And it's like, I miss the snow. Another story I thought about was, again, growing up with my twin brother. You weren't allowed to be outside in the daytime. You were just out. And as long as you were home, before my grandma started calling us, you're safe. So basically when it started getting dark, right before the street lights, I know that's probably cliche, but it's true. Right before the street light went on, you need to be touching the gate. If not, she's calling for you, and you know dinner's on the table, and you're kind of holding up things. But we spent days in the Rio. The Rio used to have water in it all the time, all day, every day. I remember we got some leftover, I don't know, lumber from someplace. There was a group of us, and we decided to put together a raft. And we got it together. I don't know how we got it together. It didn't stay together, but we got it together. And we managed to get it in the middle of the Rio, and there's 3 of us on it. I think we got like about 6 feet, and then it sunk. Right? And we had to get fished out. But we spent hours in the Rio. I mean, hours. That was just like our playground. And then what we would do is we would know where there was apple trees, where there was pear trees, where there was plum trees. And we would just eat all day long. We'd stop by Missy Smith's house, and you know she used to have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then Mrs. Coleman or somebody might have a cookie that they would part with. And we were outside all the time. And so now when you look at the Rio and it's just this creek bed, my daughter never got a chance to experience the Rio the way I did. I think that's sad. Every once in a while you see it from City Hall when it's running, and it's just so beautiful. But it used to do that all the time. And then I was thinking, because we talked about the pond, and we talked about the river rafting. So growing up, we did not have the opportunity to eat a lot of meat. So meat showed up on the weekends. So we had ground beef, enchiladas on Saturdays usually, and then on Sundays you had chicken. But during the summertime, we ate a lot of fish because my grandpa went fishing. And so he and his buddies, they would go fishing like Friday nights after work. My grandpa was a lumberjack. And then on Saturdays, they would be fishing. And I remember sitting down and cleaning the fish with my grandma. And we would have like huge catfish, huge trout. And that gave you the opportunity to, you know, you would clean fish, and then maybe grandma would send you over here, and you'd come back with butter, because somebody made butter. And then, you know, grandpa would pick something out of the garden, and then you would go up the street, and you'd come back with eggs. Right? You just literally take that, they give you eggs, you come back. My brother, we used to do that so he could get his hair cut every 2 weeks at Mr. Emmett's house. And I remember every once in a while they let us go. Mormon Lake was huge. It was like it was beautiful. My grandpa's lake was like Asher's Lake. There was lakes above. So there's Lake Mary, Low Lake Mary, and Mormon Lake, but there's lakes up this way, up on top of the hill. One of them I think is Asher's Lake, the other one I think is called Perkins Lake or something. And that was where he always used to fish. I was there last year because I was feeling nostalgic. And so I wanted to go see it. All I found was reeds. There's literally reeds there. That's all that was there. And I was like, wow. And now, because of whatever's in the water, you can only eat 4 ounces of fish. I think out of Lake Mary, I think that's what it is. We used to survive on fish during the summertime. It was a great time. I want to tell you the story about the tree in my yard. So my auntie Helen, she got some apricot seeds. This is the story. I wasn't there to be clear, so I'm just repeating the story as I heard it. And she had about 3 of them, and she planted them right outside the steps leading into the front door of the house I live in. And it grew into a tree. So when I was a kid, we used to get apricots all the time off the tree. And we would make apricot jam, we would make apricot ice cream, that hand crank thing. Like me and my brother would be out there for hours, and then you get this little tiny thing of ice cream that you have to share. Just going to get you that. And so it was just the way it was. When we moved into the house, I was thinking about 16 years ago now, we were still getting apricots. We were getting maybe a good sized bag of apricots. And then I noticed that the apricot tree would start blooming in February. It would bloom. It would be in full bloom in February, and then it's going to snow or freeze or do something weird in March, right? And then you don't get any apricots. Or if you do, you get the few that didn't die, right? The flowers that didn't die. So we went down from getting bags of apricot to a bag of apricot to this handful of apricots. And about 3 years ago, I noticed the tree was looking funny. So what is going on with this tree? I was like, this is weird, but kind of just kept going. And I planted some little shrubs, evergreens, along the fence. So I was trying to block out the neighbors next door. And the next year, I'm kind of looking at the shrubs. They're looking brown. And the apricot trees, obviously there's something wrong with this tree. So now I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with this tree. It's been here. My Aunt Helen is now 75-ish. Because, you know, aunties aren't going to tell you how old they are. You don't would ask. But my mom would have been 82. So she's the youngest, so I'm trying to figure it out. So last year, I got somebody who does trees to come over and look at it. Like, it didn't have any leaves on it, nothing. And he was like, the tree's dead. I was like, what do you mean the tree's dead? The tree's been here since I was a kid, since before I was a kid. And I'm like, by the way, why are these evergreens looking brown too? Like, what is this? And you know what he told me? He's like, have you been watering the tree? And I was like, why would I water the tree? No one's ever watered the tree. The tree's just always been here. And the evergreens, you don't water evergreens. Like, I didn't know you were supposed to water evergreens. But I guess because there's been no snow, and there's no snowpack, so the snow would sit on the ground for the evergreens in the wintertime. And that's how they get water, which is how they stay green. I didn't know. I really didn't know. And he was saying that the apricot tree, I guess apricot trees need a certain amount of water. And he was like, that's the problem with the tree. I cried. You know, maybe I should have known more about trees. But it never occurred to me that we were going to have to water this tree because the tree had never had to have water before. But he was clear, there's no snow, there's no water, there's no anything. And so the last thing I wanted to just mention is the temperature. So the house I built in, a house I lived in was my grandfather built in 1942. And he helped build a lot of houses around Flagstaff. And this house does not have central heating. You have a wall heater in the front, and you have a wall heater in the back. This house has never been cold, never been hot. It's just the way it's built. It's just worked out really well for us. The way he built the circulation for the heaters and stuff, it's just always worked. Growing up, I think the hottest it ever got here was maybe 82. And then you open up the windows and the breeze comes in and you're fine. We used to go down to Phoenix a lot to play hockey, and 110 in Phoenix was hot. I think every once in a while it might get to like 112 or something, and that was a big deal. Nowadays, 120 seems to be the norm in Phoenix, which was not normal when I was growing up. And it hit like 97 here. And so what I've noticed about the house that I live in is in the wintertime, because there's no snow, it seems to be colder. I know that sounds weird, but when there's snow on the ground, I guess it's more insulated. When there's no snow on the ground, it's just windy and cold. So the heating bills are now going up. And in the summertime, it's just hot. Instead of being hot, started out two weeks a year with the monsoons, it would get hot. Last year it was hot from May all the way to like September. So now we're doing the whole fan thing, and we're having to use that electricity in the summertime that we never used before. So I've noticed that. So I told Destiny, I was like, it looks like we're going to have to figure out how to get siding on the house and then put in central heating and central air conditioning because things have changed. And the way the house was built to handle all that, it no longer can. The house is still rock solid, but it's just hot or it's cold. So that's really all I had to just share, at least from what my experience is. And I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this.
Well, thank you very much, Coral, and thank all of you for bringing your wonderful and rich stories together on this day. I was wondering if I could ask you, Coral, about the pressures of climate on housing in Flagstaff. And you might want to say something about that.
So I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different people about this particular issue, really focusing on the issue of climate refugees and how climate change is negatively impacting the older people in our community. We have a lot of people nowadays that are coming up from Phoenix because it's just too hot. And so you see them here in town and on the weekends being able to come up so they can escape the heat. Then I counter with, well, what about the people who don't have the money are the means to be able to travel to get out of the heat in Phoenix. The ones that are working 2 or 3 jobs or just don't have the discretionary income. That also puts a lot of stress on our infrastructure here in the city of Flagstaff because our road infrastructure can only handle so many people. You also have a huge second home market here, as well as our short-term rentals, the Airbnbs, and people are starting to do that, which also pulls housing away from people that live here in Flagstaff. And then lastly, you have our seniors. I talked about the fact that I'm now having to pay more electricity in the summertime to keep these fans and things going. Well, before you knew that your gas bill was going to be a little bit higher in the winter, but summer you're fine. You know, summertime, my electric bill and my gas bill was almost nothing. Now, that's not the case. I'm lucky that I have, I think, 3 jobs right now, so I'm able to afford that. But most seniors live in a fixed income, and they don't have the opportunity for that. So you're kind of looking at how are they surviving, how is the heat affecting them, and what can be done. So that's really the stuff that I've been looking at now when it comes to climate change, temperature change, weather, whatever we're calling it today. It's an issue for people, and it's creating refugees and pushing out, quite frankly, gentrifying a lot of areas.
Thank you again, Coral. Many of these stories are now reflected on a global level. We're seeing more and more severe weather and climate-related refugees around the world. Certainly the drought that started the Syrian civil war was something that all the climate models for the Mediterranean predicted they would get greater and greater drought, and that drought drove people into the cities, which were already overflooded with refugees from Iraq. And the government could not handle those numbers. So we can expect these kinds of changes to continue. And when you were saying about changes, Jim, that you've seen, part of it too is we've seen these changes, and you know, where are we headed? It's changed this much already. What's happening next? So I generally talk about those kinds of things more in my usual data-driven presentations and whatever, so please come to one of those. But for right now, I want to thank our storytellers for their stories, and I want to open it up for questions, discussion, comments, stories, if anybody has something to contribute. Please feel free to ask your questions, and if you want to come up and tell a story, that's fine too.
I'd like to ask if you can answer a question on what Coral said and why we can't eat the fish in Lake Mary. What's wrong with them? Or what's in them?
That's a very good question. Do you know about bioaccumulation?
Uh-huh.
So heavy metals particularly are fat soluble, and so when an organism consumes any kind of heavy metal, and some pesticides too, they accumulate in fat. Then if a predator eats that organism, it gets that dose and eats another one, it gets a dose, so there's biomagnification up the food chain. Well, so the fish are the top predators in streams and rivers often. And so they accumulate heavy metals and some toxic pesticides and other kinds of
Where are
things.
they coming from? I mean, where around here are the heavy metals and the pesticides coming from?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure that I know all those answers, but we could get Dr. Catherine Proper in to tell you in detail. She studies endocrine disruptors particularly, and those kinds of things. Sometimes heavy metals come from land runoff, and in agricultural areas you get increases in heavy metals for that reason. And also because of the fertilizers containing a variety of things. In our region, I'm a little bit less clear, but
Coal-fired
yes.
power plants are the source of mercury.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
So she's pointing out that through air pollution, we are getting things from like the Navajo generating station and other air pollution sources. And those can certainly be affecting watersheds.
It's
So-
mercury.
And mercury is one of the key
It's in the water.
things that biomagnifies and bioaccumulates. So that comes from coal burning. Yes.
My turn?
Bob, yes, go.
Well, how do we convince the unbelievers that all this problem is due to human activity?
You guys go if you got something.
Then I'm gonna get on my political bandwagon. I don't think you want to hear that.
Okay, yeah.
You know, I mean, right now, you know, you've got, you know, fake news, and is basically the same thing as propaganda. So, you know, the powers that be that are going to be benefiting from a lot of the soothsaying that there is no climate change, there is no global warming, are basically profiting somewhere along the lines so that, you know, we as, you know, John Doe don't sit there and have a voice in what's going on. And so that's my stand on it, is that, you know, you're just getting disinformation slammed at you from all different directions. And so I'm just telling you by the seat of my pants that I'm seeing this happen, and this is what's going on when I'm looking at the world out there. You as individuals have to sit there and see what's happening in your world and how you understand it. And then all the fake news and propaganda that you get from all the different sources, you're going to have to figure out how to, you know, weed through it, because that's just what's happening in this day and time.
Well, I think the science is settled. It's settled, but what is not settled are the political and social discussions. And I think those are very, very tough, particularly given, as Donnie says, the current political climate. But, you know, we're not going to make progress until we further the political and social recognition of this. The science is settled, in my opinion.
Yeah, 98% of the sciences, you know, but there's still a lot of people going with the 2%
Yeah.
and say no.
Yep.
I think, aren't we the only country in the world that associates science and climate awareness with politics? And that the rest of the countries, the rest of the world has made that separation, but that we have somehow, at some point historically, tied them together. I think that's correct.
We have a very different situation in our own country than most of the rest of the world, as you point out. And as Jim was saying, there's a whole, and Donnie was saying, there's a whole industry of misinformation. There's a book that you might be interested in, Merchants of Doubt. So what once was the misinformation campaign of the tobacco industry has evolved into the misinformation campaign of the dinosaur technologies. We need to get past that in a variety of ways. And so I'm glad y'all are here, because that's part of what this is about. Question over here.
Well,
Jenny.
I was just going to offer, the deniers are a smaller and smaller part of our population every year, and they're not anywhere close to the majority. So there's just a lot of reason for hope, and frankly, talking about climate change is one of the most powerful things that you can do. It's why this event is so powerful. So I would just say there's so much reason for hope, and just keep talking. You know, as you guys all said, it's just to talk about it.
We have a question over here, and then, yes.
So, I'm going to play devil's advocate. Yes, our current political climate is frightening, it's frustrating, what have you. But at the same time, Mr. Babbitt has a background in cattle ranching. It's a very important part of Northern Arizona's history. It's a very important part of our current economic situation. And yet, agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. Donnie runs a great business, which I've taken advantage of, but he's using internal combustion engines to get folks to and from the river. And, you know, if we look at major drivers of economics in Northern Arizona, if we say, well, we're not going to do coal-powered electricity any longer, we have to come up with a way to help the Navajo Nation deal with that blow to its economy. So we need to not just say, okay, it's bad, but we need to start coming up with things to do to fix it. And also look at ourselves and say, golly, there's an awful lot of cars in the parking lot right now. So, yes, we can bash the Republicans all we want, but it's our entire society that's going to have to make major changes in order to reverse this terrible trend. Sorry, didn't mean to rain on the parade.
That's a very important part of mine. Thank you. Yes.
I think you got a question.
Well, I'd like to answer you. You're absolutely right. So we were talking about misinformation campaigns, but fossil fuels are a very cheap and easy form of energy. And we have all gotten addicted to the benefits of that cheap and easy energy. And so I know you rode your bike here, so that's exactly what we all should be
But
doing.
I also drive an F-250. I don't want to be perceived as somebody who's preaching holier than thou. I'm not. I have the same issues.
So we're all on that same boat. It's easy, and we need to find ways to reduce our own carbon footprint, each in our own way, and we need to do it pretty fast if we want to avoid the things that came out in the October special report from the IPCC. I'll try to schedule with Leanne. So I also want to point out to everybody, Leanne Giunta is our community organizer for NAZCCA, and so many of you have probably communicated with her or received communication from her, and hopefully in the future as well. So we will try to schedule some of those presentations that have to do not just with the issues, but also with the solutions. We'll try to reschedule those again soon.
But it's small steps, and we can't be deterred by the small steps. Using iPads instead of paper to sign in, having liquids but not having the plastic cups. Those small steps are really valuable, and they do bring about change.
They are.
And
Thank you.
by example.
And there was a question over here.
I was just going to make a comment, and I'll preface it with, in graduate school I taught a course on planetary atmospheres. And the history of understanding the greenhouse effect and global warming really began before the 1900s, when a fellow determined, hey, carbon dioxide, this does that. So the actual science is pretty simple and can be demonstrated in a high school, it can be demonstrated in your own house. So what has happened over these years? Well, economies have grown, it hasn't been a big problem. And then when it began to be measured and began to be able to estimate some trends, which actually was almost 40 years ago, then energy companies, because that was one of the major greenhouse effects, chemicals, began to get concerned. And so that is where the false science began to come. And it was exactly as you said, the cigarette companies. Oh, no. Way back before the World War II, they knew that cigarettes was causing problems. So my point is simply that there is no doubt, as you said. The science is over 100 years old. And what's happening, and I like to make this analogy. The science says we're going like a son of a gun in a car. What we don't know is when we're going to hit that tree. But it's going to happen sometime. And that's where now people are saying, well, sure, it's changing a little bit, but it's not. That's what I am most afraid of, is that unknown. Where are we going to get to the tipping point? And I want to finish by saying that history tells us a lot in the opposite direction. Certain things would happen, and our population would grow dramatically, and then it would reach a level. And then something else would happen, and it would grow. For example, when potatoes were brought from North America, South America, it allowed for Europe to stop to blossom. Okay. Then there was a kind of a slowing down of the population. But then science, modern science began about the 1500s and 1600s. And that began to cure people and allow another big population growth. So we've been going in that direction with technical changes. What's amazing to me is when we develop the science and the understanding of where we shouldn't grow or we should do what we're doing differently, we ignore that or seem to ignore it. It's the short 4 months, quarter, that type of thing. So I, as a scientist, retired scientist, but very frustrated. It's not just the politics, it's people like us. We need more meetings like this. We need them in Phoenix. We need them all over the country. So thank you very much for doing this.
I think Coral has a response, please.
Well, I have a response to you, but I think more about what you said. So I'm going to try to tie it all together. And I had said something like this at council, I guess, the other night when we were talking about our climate adaptation and action mitigation plan. What I see, and I'm speaking solely as just somebody who is in different neighborhoods, is that I see these types of conversations are great, but there are a whole bunch of people that are not in these types of conversations. And the reason why I say that, it was kind of just triggered by what you said. I remember in Sunnyside, we had someone come to a meeting, and she was a she walked in, and she was going to help us learn how to conserve and recycle, right? And we were just kind of looking at her like, maybe you should ask us what we do. I'm sitting here looking, and I want to put Shonto on the spot, but you have Native American people who have been in this region for like 600 years. Why don't we ask them? I mean, and I go back to even the discussion then. We were looking at like this whole urban farming and how to grow stuff here in Flagstaff. You have some, I'll just be blunt, black families that have been here for generations that can grow watermelon here in a short season, but they're not considered to be master gardeners because they don't have whatever it is you're supposed to have a master gardener. And I'm not making light because I think master garden certificates are great and all that, but I remember this lady and she was going to teach us how to conserve and recycle, and it was like we reuse our foil, like we wash the foil and we reuse it. We take the bus because we don't have a car, not because it's cool and all that, but because we literally don't have a car. Or we drive an old car and we don't have a new one because we don't have the money to drive it. We're on bicycles because that's really how we get around. And so sometimes I look at these conversations about climate change and I wonder if the broader society is now worried because it's getting hot and maybe we won't have a place to live. But remember I even talked about people now coming up from Phoenix because it's too hot there. What triggered my whole interest in that had to do with in the Carolinas, because the water is now rising. The poor people actually lived up on top of the hill because it was undesirable. And other people lived down by the waterfront because they had the opportunity to buy that. Well, guess what? It's flooding now. So what are those people doing? They now have the money to come up here and buy 2 or 3 lots, and they're gentrifying it. I just think the conversations that we're having, we should go ask people who've been here 600 years, how'd you guys do it? You guys always have water? What's working? I mean, I just look at some of this, and I think it's not really about science. I don't think it really is about political stuff. I think it's about what Mr. Babbitt had to say. It's about the social conversation that we keep dancing around. That's just my personal opinion.
All right.
Well, I'd just like to chime in with Coral. I think that's absolutely right. We do have a lot of wisdom in our different communities that we're not drawing on. And we have a lot of wisdom amongst our elders that we're not drawing on. And so this event was an attempt to set that at least a little bit right.
I just wanted to thank the conveners of this, and I think I'm getting close to retirement, so everything has a little bit of an interesting lens for me. But I'm getting old. Maybe I'll be an elder someday, I hope. I think probably the most important thing for me, and the thing that I really want to say to everyone here, is that we have to get away from our screens and begin talking to one another. I mean, we really need to begin having meaningful conversations with words, not with our fingers. Because what we're missing is the human connection. And as a teacher, it's brought home to me every day. But as a citizen and as a human being, I see that the lack of connection, one to one, to one, to one, is so depleted in our society. And until we just start turning our phones off or leaving them in the car and go into buildings and talk to human beings and listen to them, we're going to have a harder and harder time having conversations in which we can address the issues which are on our hearts. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a great program, but I think we're preaching to the choir, aren't we? How about offering it to high school student assemblies and let the kids know that they got a lot of power if they aggregate, and let folks know that the situation is dire for them, worse than for us old geezers like my wife and I. Raise a fuss. Maybe they can get through to people.
I think that's an excellent point as well. There is a big movement in Europe, particularly right now, Greta Thunberg and all students walking out of class on Fridays in protest that our generation and the older generations are not doing enough. Where that movement will, and it has to some degree carried over to our country. Mm-hmm. So do y'all think we should do this kind of thing again?
Yes, absolutely.
Perhaps we can do it at high schools. We'll look into that.
Go to high school and tell them to strike on Friday.
we might not try that. Jim.
I just wanted to follow up on what Coral said. Could the rest of the panel share their solutions for what they, from their perspective? Because I think we're in this time of peak indifference where solutions are what we really need to talk about with our personal values. And that's what they've all shared with us, is their personal values. And I think that's the part that's so powerful, because we're all storytellers, and that's how we communicate, is through stories. So the more that we practice storytelling, the more engaging, the more interesting it is than an iPad or an iPhone. So I think that if, like they shared their stories, and also let's let, like Coral was saying, some of the solutions her community is already doing. I mean, they're ahead light years just because their carbon footprint's so low to begin with, So what?
Well, I would sit there, and if I had a magic wand, and sometimes when some people think I'm kind of a little off the wall on some of my ideas, but I've always loved Flagstaff. When I first got here, I was kind of going, oh wow, let's do this, do this. We helped start a charter school. We helped start a new business. We did all this stuff to make life better for our family, so that our family and our friends' families would sit there and be richer. So, I would sit there and look out and say, oh, only if we could, have some sort of transportation or some sort of, my son was off in Chile or somewhere where he says, oh, Dad, you should have seen these gondolas. They went all the way around the mountain, and you could just hop on one anywhere. You could sit there and speed right to the next place, and you could get off and go somewhere. And I was going, wow, what a cool idea, having the gondola system going completely around a mountain. And I was going, that's really, and then I thought about Flagstaff. Oh, wind. Nah, not going to work. But things like this, and and then you see different parts of our government. lots of things that some people don't like about what California does, and trying to sit there and bring solar energies, making new buildings have to have solar power. We don't have an infrastructure or a grid to sit there and support any of that action. And a lot of my friends are solar installers, and they said, look, until we can get stuff that sit there and makes it to where people can use this reusable energy in these ways, it says it's just not going to work. So we need a lot of help from the government. We need a lot of help from people that are involved. And I'll be honest, I work with so many people, so many things that I do just myself, that I have a difficult time having enough energy and time to do all these other things. And just to come here and do this, I have a group that's coming off the river that was expecting me, and I came here instead.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just had a comment. I don't know about all of you. We're all on our way of being elders, so we're in one direction. So I remember watching the film An Inconvenient Truth. That's when I was first horrified and alerted, and that was a long time ago comparatively. And when I watched it, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much scientific facts behind this, and we're watching it and we can see it. And this was, I think, in the late 90s or early 2000s when Al Gore came out with this. And I was like, well, thank goodness we have really, really knowledgeable and smart people in public service and in our government that'll take care of all that for us. That's what I thought. I was like, well, thank goodness we have a lot of scientists out there, and they're on that. And guess what? No, they're not. If you're like me and you thought, oh, the smarter people and the people out there, we're going to take care of it, we have to take care of it. So we have to start voting and supporting people in office who will take care of it and will be proactive and not just, do talking points and have a movie. But that's our role, is to really, really get engaged in the community. Vote in your municipal elections. Vote in your state elections. Every vote matters. Every single one. Every person in this room divided by millions of people. You all matter. And so I really, really think, and this was a long time ago, and I've been talking to voters since I was 18 years old, and I've seen the difference and the sort of the apathy and the discouragement that people have. So we just all have to tell our friends, our family, have those difficult discussions during holidays, and really talk about the hard issues. Not because it's political, but because it's humane. So we have to take care of our environment, and we have to take care of each other. And that includes people who are disenfranchised and who are living in poverty, who are going to suffer the most if we don't do anything. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, I certainly agree that small things are very, very important. That we all can do paper cups rather than plastic cups and stuff. But clearly that's not going to get us there. And I was really interested in hearing what Nat White said about science's place in allowing further expansion of all of us. And when we kind of get to a plateau, there's science helping us survive longer and dominate the planet more. And my favorite environmental writer is a lady named Elizabeth Colbert. She wrote a book called The Sixth Extinction, and that's going to be us.
I read it.
And she says, basically this planet is full. We're full of. And the hardest discussion, which I don't want to go to, but I'm going to go to, because nobody ever does, eventually there have to be fewer of us.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to talk about that. But the planet is full.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking about overpopulation for decades, and you're right. And I'm afraid almost to bring it up even in a meeting like this, because people say, oh no, now you want to control how many kids we have. Right. And you run into so much hassle, but I'm glad you brought it up.
Questions?
I would like to just, in the spirit of hope and solution, thank Coral particularly and the City Council a couple of years ago for standing up and unanimously voting for a carbon fee and dividend, which is one national solution for climate change, which essentially puts a fee on the carbon and fossil fuels that's currently not being paid for, and then returns that money back to households. So there is a bill in Congress now, and I brought some little quarter-pager things so you can pick them over by where Mark is sitting. But what Coral did in a local setting, this is a big national policy, right? And what you did along with the other council members is voted, yeah, let's call for this thing. It's big, it's bold, we need it, help us do what we need to do here by Congress passing this bill. And what you did masterfully in that meeting was to bring the other doubters along that says, this is a big idea, there's going to be details coming later, we can hash it out when the bill's there, but you did a beautiful job in leadership. So I think we have here in the room one giant bit of solution of people who are willing to step out and take leadership. So thank you.
I just wanted to say something in addition to what my husband said. If you look around the room, a large percentage of the people here are older people, like we are. We're not going to be around to see the disastrous effects of this. The younger generation will be, and they're the ones that really need to be reached. And they don't always listen to elders.
Don't look at
me. But that would be a start, to have people like these people speak about the experience. We have the wisdom because we've experienced it. But the younger generation does not, and they are the solution to this, really.
You have a person in the younger generation here.
Yeah, I just want to second that because I was going to say.
No, you first.
Oh, come back to the when it was said, bring the young people in. I think I'm hearing that a lot of young people today are depressed, and they're looking at what the world in front of them appears to be, what's going to happen. And then the elders have a lot of wisdom, and of course, even in between. But I think this idea of bringing young people together with elders, not for elders to preach at, but as mentors to some degree, and share wisdom, but ask the young people to come forth and how they feel and what their ideas are. And starting in a community like this, and just see what happens and see if we can get them off. What really scares me is that everyone is tied to their cell phones and their iPads, and I don't see people communicating. I see them out walking even in the park with their children, but that's another issue. But yeah, that idea that was mentioned of bringing the young people and the elders and everybody else, but just listen first. Just ask them to talk. And share our wisdom.
Hi, I am a young people. You guys have the wisdom, but you also got the dollar. You need to mobilize the dollar. You gotta you gotta vote for Green New Deals. You gotta vote for mobilizing Conservation Corps, young people with tools, bulldozers, shovels, mobilizing them, empowering them, giving them voice. You need to give them a living wage. And I know this may sound like great political talking points, XYZ, but if you want to have people really do stuff, we got to be able to provide for ourselves. We are willing to work. We're done working for retail shops. We're done working for all the big box stores. Give us some Carhartts and boots and some steel tools, and we want to do some pretty radical stuff. Localize agriculture, localize fuel and timber resources, do a bunch of preventative stuff for climate change adaptation, trains, gondolas, new forms of transportation. We got to think things big. We got to think about moving the entire city or the entire state of Bangkok to Phoenix, Arizona, not Phoenix, to Flagstaff. We have a lot of big things coming up, and we do not have the infrastructure for it. We have to think we need to think about moving New Orleans to Columbus, Ohio. We need to think about undamming stuff. We need to think about big stuff and stuff that we don't even know what to do. We need to think about restoring prairie lands, restoring large mammals to their historical ranges. But first, you gotta pay us. You gotta give us money. That's the beginning thing. You gotta vote. You gotta just spam your congressman to stupid extents, and let them know that you're concerned for your grandchildren's grandchildren, because I'm concerned that I'm simply not going to be able to have a full-time job with a college degree. Have more conversations about this all the time, everywhere. Get the DOT involved. Get anyone with a bulldozer to make agricultural infrastructure. We need to mobilize our various things of growth, and we're dealing with a lot of destruction of the past 200 years or so. The only solution that we have is probably just creation. We need to create things that we just don't know exist yet. That's it for now.
Yes.
I just wanted to add to that and to what she said earlier. Not only do we need to vote, but I think we need to run for office, and we need to do that tax-free, because we are the people who can lead our country, and we're taught for so long that politicians are this abstract thing, but we can be the politicians. So that's all.
Question in the very back.
Diana Batoni, Director of the Upward Bound Program at Northern Arizona University. Bringing the elders together with the high school age students that I direct the program for. Ms. Coral Evans, you've spoken to these students. This would be the third summer that we're going to request that you speak to them. The students are from 5 high schools, so Flagstaff, Coconino, Hopi High School, Williams, and Winslow. Very, very diverse group of students, and I would love to see this summer the high school students together with our knowledgeable elders and have them hear the stories so that they can start coming up with solutions and build that collaborative team that's going to make a difference. So, date to be scheduled for the month of June. Yes, thank you.
I wanted to say that I guess this is directed to you, Mr. Shonto. I feel like we're not respecting the mountain, and because we're not respecting the mountain, our weather is kind of crazy, and this is just my crazy belief, but I think the mountain makes its own weather. But I do, because it's sacred and it's beautiful, and we need to protect it. And I think because we're putting fake snow on it, that it's trickling down and it's affecting the rest of the environment, whether it's the microenvironment or the whatever kind of environment you want to say. But I think because we're disrespecting that mountain, it's affecting all of us. And we're getting it downstream because everything comes from the mountain. But
very, very true. You know, as a member of a very earth-based, earth-worshipping people that I'm a part of, that we all are a part of in some way or another, it is listening to the land, the nuances of changes, placing offerings, visiting sites, and giving it, all of it. Every morning we wake up, as much as we can, wake up in the morning, early in the morning, center ourselves again, once again before we go into the day. Being thankful to the Mother, the Earth, the Father, the sky, and everything in between. Everything that calls the Mother, the Earth, the Mother, and sustains life from it is what we're a part of. And that's what That's why I still have faith also in the young people, because they know it's their fight. So I moved here partly because of the mountain here. Our sacred altar to the west, we're surrounded by 4 sacred mountains among the Navajos. You know, it's Hesperus in Colorado, Blanco in southern Colorado, Taylor over in the south in New Mexico, and Dokosklid right here. So it's always said when the last offering is done and the earth respected no more, you know, big change time. Big change time. Navajo would call it Shahanahapita. When all the things, when the earth shifts, when time shifts, when everything shifts, when we step into the 5th world, I suppose. So I still have faith in the young people. My kids are very all fighting for climate, for social justices and stuff like that. Very important things that they're involved in. I'm just an artist. I just view. I just recreate my world the way I see it, the way I remember it, the way I want it to be, I suppose. But kind of sending that prayer in strokes and lines and colors and forms every day. And that is my contribution to, you know, a restoration. Because I still hear my elders say, this is not our land, this is not our time, this is not our world. We're just borrowing it from our great-grandchildren. So you're right, you know, we just need to have more respect for the land and have a much more, because we're constantly building things between us and the earth, and we're no longer touching the earth. So a lot of that stems from that, you know, the weakening of the ties, also weakening the tie, you know, within our social constructs, and we're tearing our world to shreds. So just prayers and all that energy works, all of that practice, little practices. When I see a horned toad, I pick up a horned toad gently, put it on your chest, your heart, and say, "Yad Esheche." Hello, my grandfather. Hello, my elder. And you put it back exactly how and where, because this is where your strength comes from. All symbols like that, strength comes from that, and you're part of all of that. So, thank you for listening to us.
Thank you.
There are 2 words that come to my mind that I think if you walk out of here with just those 2 words in your mind, you can figure out how to help. One comes from the movie called The Graduate in 1968. And Preston Hoffman was by the swimming pool by an elder, and he looked at him and said, "Plastics." And, I'm older than bubble wrap, and think about how much bubble wrap there is. It probably comes to all of our houses, probably almost every day. So the second word is consumption. We're 4%, 5% of the population, and we consume 25% of the energy. We have to make choices. I was at my father's house last week. He's 99. And I was there to nurse him back to health after an operation. But I looked through his kitchen, and almost all of the pots and pans and all of those utensils are the same ones I used growing up. So, you know, replacing things constantly, having the newest of everything. I have these pants not because they're the style, and I bought them this way. Had them for a while, but walking, I walk to work every day. My dad walked to work every day. It's a cultural thing, but consumption, plastic and consumption.
Thank you, Don. I think we're getting towards the end of our time. I just wanted to thank Shonto for his final words, and maybe add to it a little bit. So I grew up going to Sweat with a bunch of old Paiutes every Sunday, and the medicine man would always end his prayers by praying for all his relations. And he didn't just mean his family. He meant all the animals, all the plants, the rocks, everything. We're part of this. We're part of this life. And so if we keep that philosophy at our core, it will help us make better decisions. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.